Okay, so today's lecture is about what I'm calling the long 1960s and the ends of Christian Britain. But I want to start by just saying something about my relationship to the 1960s, because it was a decade in which I'm born and for which I have a pretty much love-hate relationship with. So everything that you're going to hear today comes from that rather ambivalent, my rather ambivalent position to it. And I'm ambivalent, I think, for a couple of reasons. The first is that as a historian, I'm not much taken by the history of decades. The study of specific decades has become endemic to, particularly to the study of the 20th century. And the idea is that you can capture a particular mood or aura of a historical moment by decade. But that is, if you think about it for very long at all, that's clearly an absurd idea. The forces of historical change don't work in 10-year cycles. So in fact, studying decades looks like a very arbitrary way of shaping the chronology of any type of study. And really one of the key things I'm going to be trying to get across to you today is that the changes that I'm interested in talking to you about today that happened in the 60s actually had their roots in, many of them had their roots in the 1950s, and many of them also don't fully develop until the 1970s, hence this rather clumsy idea of the long 1960s. In fact, I would suggest that the very idea of the 1960s as a particular historical moment is itself a product of the revolt against it, and probably most famously represented in the critiques of the permissive era developed by Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in California and the US. So in some ways this idea of the 60s comes from its critics more than from the proponents of the developments of that time. So there's an ambivalence about the study of decades, but there's also an ambivalence just because of my own historical situation. As I said, I was born in the 1960s, but I basically came of age in the post-punk generation where we would routinely chant death for hippies. I mean, it was the hippie generation that we greatly detested. And we detested them not just because they had crap music, which I think is unquestionably the case, but because of their general disengagement from social life. Or rather, the idea that was seen to be very important to this notion of the 1960s of the development of alternative forms of politics and of culture and of lifestyle that would form a new type of ground for emancipation, for personal emancipation in particular. And for my generation, that dream of emancipation seemed like a chimera, seemed like an impossible thing. Hence, the parade of endless white, miserable men playing guitars that you have encountered every time you come into this room. And yet, what I want to do is try and take seriously what the 60s represented as a type of revolt and how important that was for the transformation of Britain. I played the Who's My Generation this morning because I see the 60s and the story that I want to tell about the 60s is primarily the revolt of a particular generation. It's really about the coming of age of youth culture and youth politics and the transformations that put in place. And the key theme really was that the past was no longer going to be the guide to the future. There is, I think, a powerful critique of the paternalism that ran through both the ancient regime and through liberalism and through the technocratic forms of expertise of the social democratic state. And in this critique of paternalism, of this endemic strand of paternalism that runs through British history from the beginning of this course to this moment, one of the key criticisms, of course, of it is that it was blind to the politics and the experience of youth, of gender, of sexuality, and of race. So the 60s I'm going to talk to you about then is this generational revolt that tries to discard this deep, lurking, lingering paternalism in British politics and society. Now, the emergence and politicization of youth culture during the 1960s was not, of course, unique to Britain. It was very much a transnational process. We can see the emergence of new commodified forms of youth culture in many parts of the world, particularly, of course, in the US from the 1950s. We can see also the political mobilization of students across Euro-America during the 1960s. We can see the interest in civil rights taking place across many countries at this moment. And, of course, we can see also the growth of a so-called third wave of feminism also occurring across Europe and the US. And this would also be true of the new forms of black nationalism that emerged at this time. What I'm going to try and do today, though, is not go over those familiar stories because students of Berkeley, God forbid, don't need to be told anything more about the 1960s. It's inscribed in the very campus that we circle around. What I want to do instead is to give you a sense of the peculiar character of the 1960s as a youthful revolt, as a generational revolt in Britain. It wasn't, I think, it didn't occur on anything like the same scale as it did in France or in the US, but I think it was no less influential for that. And one flavour of this peculiar nature of the 60s in Britain was, of course, its drawing on Britain's own indigenous radical tradition. So it's no accident that this issue of the Black Dwarf, which was a radical leftist magazine set up in 1968 and runs through to 1972, took its name from the radical newspaper of that name that had been formed in 1817, that formed a key place for criticism, for the development of the radical movement and of criticisms of the Peterloo Massacre, and ran through to the 1820s. So there are one element of this peculiarity is this reach back to indigenous forms of history that could reanimate radical politics during Britain's 1960s. But the real peculiar character I'm going to suggest is the relationship of this revolt to the forms of social democracy that had emerged during the decades after the Second World War. And the real question is whether it represented a critique of social democracy or an extension of its radical promise. Whether what the radical youth politics of the 1960s were trying to hold true to social democracy, but extend its universal promises in ways that they felt had been compromised. Now, a couple of things I want to highlight now that will run through the entire lecture. The first is this theme of paternalism and elitism. I've been trying to suggest to you in the last few lectures that social democracy in Britain was not of the people, it was for the people. That it was very much a paternalist project created by the new forms of technocratic expertise that had emerged and come to be dominant in the 1940s and the 1950s and 1960s. And that these people, this revolution, had been presided over by what I called last week the intellectual aristocracy, an upper middle class intellectual group of intellectuals, and their fusion with the old forms of aristocratic elite power. In a way, we can also think we have to remember the centrality of the family too. The family is, of course, the sort of ground zero of paternalism. It's the very basis of the organisation of paternal authority, with the male head of household ruling over the women and children. And we must remember that that idea of the family, which in many ways takes particular type of shape in the early 19th century, is reconsolidated in the decades after the Second World War. So this paternalism isn't just an elite political formation. I'm also suggesting that it runs through and structures everyday life in people's families. But I'm also going to be indicating to you today that the counterculture that emerges in the 1960s actually reinscribes a new type of cultural elitism. In many ways, it comes out of some of the critiques of mass culture and the idea that you can have an elite vanguard that would transform culture in more progressive dimensions. Another key theme of this lecture is the idea of the end of the Victorian moral code, whether the 1960s represent the moment when the forms of Christian authority and of the authority of the Anglican Church that had been so cemented during the liberal era, when the Church of England is re-energised by the evangelical revival, whether its forms of moral authority are finally laid to rest in the decades of the 1960s, that people no longer look to the Anglican Church as the sort of moral guardian of the nation. And then the third thing that I'm going to be talking about throughout today is the idea of trying to point to the way in which culture becomes a new ground of politics. This isn't really new. I've been talking about critiques of mass culture for a number of weeks now. But what we have instead is the idea of culture forming the basis of new counter-publics, new types of counter-culture that would give rise to new forms of identity politics, whether that's around feminism, whether it's about new forms of sexuality, whether it's about the politics of youth or race. And all of these refuse not just old-style leftist politics, but they also refuse the centrality of the state that had been so firmly established in the social democratic system. So in short, what I'm basically going to be saying to you is that the peculiar character of the 1960s in Britain is in many ways a product of the entire historical sequence that I've been trying to talk to you about throughout this class. And I think this should become apparent. I hope it will become apparent as the lecture progresses. Okay, so let's move on to the end of deference. Now, let's begin by reminding you again of how the Anglican Church had been one of the central pillars of the ancient regime in Britain's 18th century. How that Anglican Church had in many ways been rescued by the evangelical revival that Methodism began in the middle of the 18th century, and how it became cemented during the 19th century as the key form of moral authority for the population at large, with, of course, the monarchy remaining, as it had been since the Glorious Revolution, as the head of the Anglican congregation. Now, one of the key issues that we have to grapple with today is how the influence of the Anglican Church begins to recede. You'll remember that there have been many anxieties about the declining grasp of the Anglican Church in the 19th century, that the so-called religious census of 1851 had shown how few working-class inhabitants of cities attended the church, and there have been a continuing debate throughout the second half of the 19th century about the disappearance or the declining numbers of attending church. But it's also the case that the church continued to play a central role in marking the key rites of passage in people's lives. So one of the two important figures that you need to get here is that in 1972, 70% of people were still getting married in the Church of England, and 60% of people were still getting baptized in that church in 1956. Okay, so even at the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s, you see that the church still has a very central role in the key moments where people mark the passage of life. What you can also see in these figures is that it's in the decades following the 60s that these drop quite severely. So by 1997, 39% of people were getting married in the Anglican Church, and by 1981, just 36% of the population were getting baptized there. But it wasn't just about the declining role that the church played at these key moments in people's lives. It was also about the degree to which the church had provided the moral framework around which the Victorian moral code had been established. Remember all of those campaigns to do away with all of the bad things like gambling and violence against animals and drink and all of that type of stuff. And you can see that one of the key developments in the 60s is a wave of so-called permissive legislation. Permissive in the sense that it seemed to relax that old Victorian moral code. Gambling is legalised in 1960. The death penalty is abolished in 1965. In 1967, you have the decriminalisation of abortion and of homosexuality, on which more in a moment. You have divorce, the reform of the divorce laws in 1969. What you see in this image here, I think very importantly, is an argument between Lord Soper, who was an abolitionist, arguing for the abolition of the death penalty, and a member of the clergy who continued its support. Basically, in almost all of these issues, the Church of England was in favour of the retention, i.e. keeping the old form of legislation, not the abolition or reform. So the Church of England is in many ways on the wrong side of this movement to a more progressive or so-called permissive series of reforms. It wasn't just, of course, the declining place of the Anglican Church in everyday lives of Britons. What you also have, in terms of this, the end of deference, is a growing suspicion or a growing awareness of the hypocrisy of the ruling class and of their own moral frameworks. So there is a rejection, very importantly, of the idea that the old ruling classes, that people should be deferential to those old ruling classes and to the moral frameworks that they had kept going. So 1963 is a really big moment here, because it's the moment where two important events happen. The first, as you can see from this image of a man reading Lady Chatterley's Lover on a train and two men beside him peering over his shoulder to try and read the dirty bits, it was the year of the Lady Chatterley trial. Lady Chatterley was, of course, the novel written by... Oh my God, how embarrassing. D.H. Lawrence, thank you. God, a moment of complete brain freeze. Was D.H. Lawrence's famous novel written around the First World War that had basically been kept out of publication for its obscene bits, or rather, there had been abridged versions of it that had passed the censorship laws. In 1963, Penguin Trine published a full edition of the book. which you'll remember is all about not just the sexual awakening of the aristocratic Constance Chatterley, but her sexual awakening at the hands of her gamekeeper. So not only do you have a woman discovering her sexuality, but you have it by a member of an aristocratic woman doing it at the hands of a member of the working class. The trial became famous because the chief prosecutor at that trial asked at the jurors if it was the kind of book that you would want your wife or servants to read. And this, of course, the Penguin's defence team leapt upon as showing how out of touch the establishment were, that people really genuinely believed that most people still had servants, or that men should be prescribing to their wives what they should read. The other big event of 1963 was the Profumo affair. Profumo was the Conservative Secretary of State for War, and he was exposed in the press as having an affair with a cool girl called Christine Keeler, who was reputed to be the mistress of a Soviet naval attaché that was widely understood to be a Russian spy. Profumo's big error here was to deny the fact that this affair had taken place in the House of Commons, and then, of course, the press had a field day showing him that was a lie, and he was forced to resign by June. It was a key moment in the destabilisation of the Conservative government. And a few months later, in October, Harold Macmillan resigns on the grounds of ill health, but most people had a very profound sense in 1963 that the Conservative government that had been in power for 13 years now seemed sort of morally compromised, that there was something rotten in the state of Canberra. So the growing anxiety about this these declining moral standards was also reflected in the rise of the increasing visibility and coverage of a series of violent crimes that almost became portrayed. So two of them became portrayed in almost heroic fashion. The first was the Great Train Robbery, where a massive amount of gold bullion was stolen from a train, and the other was the trial of the Craig brothers, a famous East End a crime gang in 1969. And in the middle of that was the infamous Moore murders in 1965, which was a big serial murder case propagated by a couple on young children. So there's a growing awareness here of a sort of laxity of moral standards reflected in these rise of violent crimes. The last component I want to talk about with this was the rise of comedy. The rise of comedy that was deeply satirical and was aimed primarily at lampooning the upper ruling classes of the country. And there are a whole series of these. The first was the Goon Show that began in 1951 and ran through the 1960s and into 1960. Second was the launch of Private Eye, the satirical magazine still going in 1961. TV program called That Was the Week That Was in 1962, and then probably the only one that you'll recognise of all of this, the beginning of Monty Python in 1969. All of these comedy programs, to lesser or greater degrees, tried to demonstrate the absurdity of the old paternalist structures of authority and the sort of conservatism of an older generation. And I'm going to just play you a clip of Monty Python in order to try and get this across. Okay, I'm afraid I have a lot to get on with, so much as I could watch Monty Python all day. There is, of course, a reaction to all of this. I mean, it's unimaginable that sketch could have been made even a decade earlier, such as its irreverence to the aristocracy. But there's a reaction which is not so much a defence of the aristocracy as a defence of this moral code, of this Victorian moral code. And it comes in many forms, but the best illustration of it for our purposes, I think, is the so-called Festival of Light, organised by a series of so-called moral guardians. And you see here probably the two most famous, Cliff Richard, the so-called rock star, and Mary Whitehouse, the campaigner for the clean-up of TV. Basically, they were against the proliferation of sex and violence in the mass media, which they thought reflected this collapse of the moral collapse of society. In 1970 and 1971, they held a whole series of rallies around the country, culminating in a big rally in September of 1971 in Trafalgar Square, which reputedly attracted 10,000 people. So in other words, from the get-go, there is a sense of this kind of deference being wrapped up in these two key pillars of the old system, its ruling class and the Victorian moral code of the Anglican Church. Okay, so let's move on to the student movement, which I'm going to try and describe to you as a post-colonial protest. First thing that I want to say is remind you of what I was saying a couple of weeks ago, I think last week, was that one of the key things about the new forms of politics that emerged in the post-war period was the increasing prevalence of so-called non-governmental organisations, and how many of these non-governmental organisations increasingly concern themselves with so-called international issues that exceeded the nation-state, and probably that now we think of them most as being associated with the rise of human rights and of the environmental movement. I'm going to give you the example of Amnesty International, which was formed in 1961, but had its roots in the work of its founder, Peter Benison, in South Africa in the late 1950s, when he was set up an organisation to monitor the treason trials of the African National Congress's leader, Nelson Mandela, at that moment. In other words, Amnesty began as being concerned with the position of political prisoners in the British Empire, and indeed actually in the former Portuguese Empire. So in other words, what I'm trying to suggest here is there's a new interest and awareness with international affairs that has a very strong anti-imperial flavour at the beginning. And I think that you can see this also in the development of the New Left in Britain and its role in the student protests of the late 1960s. In fact, students have been increasingly politically active since the late 1950s, when many of them have been involved in supporting the campaign for nuclear disarmament and marching to Aldermaston.